Chapter 1. The Glove That Refused to Burn. It is an oft-repeated comfort of mine that no matter the cold greys of a London dawn, nor the restless thrum of cab wheels over wet cobblestones, I might always expect some quiet miracle to stir within the cluttered sitting room of 221B, Baker Street. On that particular morning, a drab, biting Thursday in late October, the miracle arrived not in the form of a client, but a mystery delivered by firelight. Sherlock Holmes stood before the hearth, his lean frame silhouetted against the blaze. The room carried its usual clutter, chemical apparatuses humming on the sideboard, piles of newspapers fluttering at the edges of the Persian rug, and the comforting chaos of a mind too exacting for ordinary order. But it was what Holmes held with his tongs above the flame that caught my eye. "A most curious phenomenon, Watson," he said without turning. "Observe." I leaned forward. Suspended in the tongs was a single left-hand glove, soft brown leather, supple yet worn. Holmes adjusted the angle and pressed it deeper into the heart of the flame. The fire danced hungrily around it, licking the air with golden tongues. And yet, impossibly, the glove did not burn. "It's been coated in some fire-retardant chemical," I offered. He glanced at me, lips twitching in amusement. "That, my dear fellow, was my first hypothesis. And yet, if you'll assist me," he passed the glove to me with a pair of tweezers. "Hold it to your nose." I obeyed and found myself inhaling only the scent of aged leather. No oil, no vinegar, no powder, not even the faintest trace of chemical preservative. "There's nothing unusual about it," I said, "aside from its refusal to ignite." Holmes nodded. "Indeed. That glove was recovered from the drawing-room of Sir Benedict Holworthy, late of Wexmay House, Hampshire." "You mean to say the same Holworthy whose estate burned to the ground not 4 nights ago?" "The very same." Holmes turned from the fire and settled into his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "What remains of Wexmay is but scorched stone and splinters. A tragic affair. The newspapers call it an accidental blaze. An old servant left the hearth untended. But a few items were spared. The glove, a warped brass candlestick, and the scorched but legible remains of a letter signed by Sir Benedict himself. All recovered from the center of the conflagration. Yet the man himself perished, his body discovered in his private study, burned beyond recognition. And most curiously—" He paused, eyes gleaming. "Yes. There was only one glove." Before I could press further, Mrs. Hudson entered with the Morning Post. Among the bills and routine correspondence was a single, thick envelope bearing the crest of Scotland Yard. Holmes broke the wax seal and read in silence. "Lestrade," he murmured. "He wants us in Hampshire at once. There's been a development." "A second fire?" "No," Holmes said, rising. "A second glove." The train to Hampshire was a dismal affair, the windows fogged with condensation and the air heavy with coal smoke. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet, save for an occasional murmur or tap of his fingers against the seat. I watched the countryside roll by, marveling at how quickly civilization could yield to open fields and shadowed woods. Upon arrival at the village of Wexmay, we were met by Inspector Lestrade himself, bundled tightly in a coat far too large for his frame. His expression was troubled, his usual combative demeanor softened by confusion. "Holmes, I've never seen anything like it," he said as we climbed into a waiting carriage. We were sifting through what's left of the East Wing, looking for the housekeeper's safe. Instead, we found a patch of floorboards that hadn't burned. Unburned wood, surrounded by total destruction. Holmes asked. "Aye. And in the middle of it, this." Lestrade reached into a leather satchel and produced the twin of the glove we had seen that morning. Identical in make and color. Also unburnt. "I thought it was some trick of the light," Lestrade went on. "But Holmes, the blasted thing was lying in a pool of lamp oil." Holmes took the glove carefully, eyes narrowed. "Watson, do you recall the case of the woman who left no footprints in the snow?" "Miss Alice Tulliver. The boots were frozen on the rooftop, yes." "Precisely. The absence of a phenomenon can be more telling than its presence." Lestrade huffed. You're going to have to speak plain, Holmes. I've got a house burned to cinders and 2 gloves that won't catch fire." Holmes smiled faintly. "And a dead man whose final act was either self-immolation or something far more deliberate. Wexmere House was a blackened skeleton by the time we arrived. The scent of wet ash clung to the wind, and the trees around the estate stood as silent sentinels, their barks singed and glistening with dew. Charred beams jutted from the ruins like the ribs of a fallen beast. A constable guided us to the east wing. There, amid the rubble, lay the unburned patch Lestrade had described. A square of floorboards, perhaps 3 feet across, surrounded by utter devastation. "Note the edges," Holmes said, kneeling. "There is no gradual singeing, no transition. The burn ends cleanly, like a knife's cut. What do you make of that, Watson?" I hesitated. "It suggests control. The fire was selective." "Indeed. And nature is not so particular." Holmes rose and gazed around the ruins. "Tell me, Lestrade, who benefits from Sir Benedict's death?" "His nephew, Thomas Holworthy. Poor fellow's been abroad for years, Africa or India, I think. But he returned just 3 weeks before the fire. Claims he was trying to reconnect with his uncle. A convenient time to rekindle family ties." Lestrade frowned. "You think he did it?" "I think," Holmes said, "that we must speak with him before the day ends. But first—" He knelt once more and placed both gloves side by side on the untouched floorboards. Then, without a word, he struck a match and dropped it between them. The flame sputtered, flickered, and died. Holmes straightened and fixed his gaze on the distant hills. "Watson, we are dealing not with the absence of fire, but with something that consumes only what it is allowed to consume." "I took a small sample," Holmes said. "And under the lens, it appears to be treated with a substance not unlike fine asbestos, but with organic traces. A compound I've only encountered once before, in an obscure paper on fire-resistant textiles developed during India's textile reform movement." "Then the gloves were prepared." "Precisely. But not merely to survive fire, they were planted, Watson. They were meant to be found." I blinked. "Planted by whom? And why?" Holmes tapped the table thoughtfully. "That is the question. Why save a pair of gloves, and allow a man to die? Unless—" He trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "Unless—" I prompted. "Unless the gloves were not meant to survive the fire. Unless something went wrong. Unless they were the only parts not meant to burn." He fell silent for a long moment. Then, "We must speak to Mrs. Lane, the housekeeper. Lestrade said she survived, didn't he?" "Yes, she was away that night, visiting her sister in Portsmouth." "Convenient, but perhaps genuine. Let us verify it." Holmes fetched his coat and hat. "We shall call upon her in the morning. For tonight, Watson, secure the gloves and do not let them out of your sight." I nodded, wrapping them in the linen and placing them into the small travel case we kept for specimens. Holmes turned to the window and peered into the darkness. "I feel it, Watson," he murmured. "The shape of it. The fire was not the crime, it was the smoke screen. The true crime is buried in what the fire tried, but failed, to erase." And with that, he turned away, leaving me to ponder the impossible, the glove that would not burn, the heir who knew too much, and the man who died surrounded by flame yet left behind no scream. Only silence. Chapter 3. The First Clues, A Scene of Deception. The following morning dawned bleak and grey, with fog lying thick upon the village lanes. A gentle rain fell, more a mist than a storm, yet it seemed to soften even the sharp edges of Wexmere's tragedy. Holmes and I left the Widow's Rest shortly after breakfast, making our way toward a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. It belonged to Mrs. Gertrude Lane, longtime housekeeper of the late Sir Benedict Holworthy. Holmes walked briskly, eyes fixed ahead, the collar of his coat turned up against the drizzle. "If there is one witness in all of this who may be both untainted and observant," he remarked, "it is the housekeeper. Her absence from the house on the night of the fire is both a blessing and a complication." You suspect her of something? I asked. I suspect everyone, Watson. But more importantly, I trust no one, not until I know what it is they've chosen not to tell me. We arrived at the cottage and were shown into a neat parlor where Mrs. Lane, a thin, austere woman with graying hair and downcast eyes, sat knitting by the hearth. Her movements were mechanical, almost as though her mind were elsewhere entirely. Mrs. Lane, Holmes began gently, we appreciate you receiving us. We come not merely to inspect the facts, but to understand the man who lived at Wexmere. She nodded once, her voice barely above a whisper. Sir Benedict was particular, private. He lived by a very strict routine. Rose at 6, breakfast at 7, read until noon, walked the grounds at 1, supper at 6, letters by 8. Lights out promptly at 10. Any guests? Rarely. No one since the young master returned. Thomas Holworthy. She flinched slightly at the name. Yes. Though he barely stayed more than a fortnight. Seemed agitated. Always pacing. Spent long hours in the library. They quarreled, once. Holmes leaned forward. Quarreled? About what? I do not know. I only overheard voices. Raised, then suddenly hushed. Holmes's fingers tapped idly on his cane. Tell me, Mrs. Lane, do you remember anything unusual in the days before the fire? She hesitated. There was a man, she said at last. Called on Sir Benedict 3 days before the blaze. Tall, dark coat. I never saw his face, he came at dusk. They spoke in the study for nearly an hour. After he left, Sir Benedict locked the doors and didn't emerge again until morning. Did the visitor return? No. But Sir Benedict began acting odd. He took to writing furiously, kept the study locked. He sent me to Portsmouth 2 days later, said I should visit my sister. Told me not to return until Tuesday. The fire was Sunday night. Holmes stood. Mrs. Lane, you've been most helpful. One last question. Did Sir Benedict own any gloves? She blinked. Oh yes. He had a fine pair, brown leather, soft. Wore them when walking. Liked to keep them clean. Were they lined? I believe so, yes. A silk lining. They were a gift, I think. From India. But he hadn't worn them in years. Holmes glanced at me briefly before offering a polite bow. Thank you, madam. You've illuminated more than you realize. As we stepped outside into the damp morning, I turned to Holmes. It seems Sir Benedict knew danger was coming. He sent the housekeeper away deliberately. Just so, Holmes said. Which raises a vital point. If Sir Benedict feared for his safety, why remain in the house at all? Why not alert the authorities? Perhaps he didn't know what form the danger would take. Holmes was silent for a moment. Or perhaps he did, Watson. Perhaps he believed himself prepared. We returned to Wexmere House by noon. The ruins were still smoldering, a light haze curling among the blackened beams. Lestrade waited for us near what had once been the study, now marked by fallen stone and warped metal. Afternoon, gentlemen, he said, tugging his coat collar against the chill. We found something. He led us to a corner of the wreckage where a team had uncovered a half-melted metal box, its surface blackened, but its contents mostly intact. Inside were papers, some charred, others preserved by chance. Among them was a single page, scrawled in a trembling hand. Holmes took it carefully and began to read aloud. She's remembered something. She's remembered a quarrel. 2 nights before the fire. Between Thomas Holworthy and Celia Donnell. Raised voices in the corridor outside the study. She caught a few words. You said he'd agree, and it's too soon. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Fascinating. She claims she kept quiet because she feared losing her employment, though why that should matter now, I cannot say. And Miss Donnell? I asked. She denies the whole thing. Says she barely spoke to Holworthy outside professional matters. A predictable response, Holmes murmured. And yet telling. Lestrade grinned. It's enough to justify another round of questioning. On the contrary, Holmes said suddenly. It is enough to delay such questioning. Lestrade blinked. Delay? Holmes turned toward the window. When a suspect denies something they believe cannot be proven, they feel secure. But once they suspect they've been overheard, panic sets in. Let her sit with the knowledge that the truth may be closing in. We will learn far more by watching her than by confronting her. Lestrade frowned, clearly disliking the strategy. And in the meantime? In the meantime, Holmes said, turning back to us, we visit the one person everyone is eager to forget, Thomas Holworthy. We found the heir on the veranda of a rented cottage on the north edge of the village, gazing out toward the woods. A pipe hung idly from his mouth, unlit. His eyes were hollow with sleeplessness, though whether from guilt or grief I could not yet tell. You've been busy, he said as we approached. Lestrade has already made it clear he believes I'm hiding something. And are you? Holmes asked casually. Thomas laughed, bitterly. My uncle's death was a tragedy, Mr. Holmes. But I did not kill him. I don't have the stomach for it, nor the cunning. Holmes's eyes glinted. But someone does. Thomas met his gaze squarely. Yes. And I hope to God you find them. You and Miss Donnell argued. The color drained slightly from Thomas's face. We disagreed. About what? She believed my uncle's new will would offer protection from my past. I was less certain. Your past? I asked. Thomas exhaled. I had debts. Abroad. Some unsavory dealings. She thought if we showed my uncle that I had returned in good faith, he'd forgive the rest. Did he? No. He saw right through me. Holmes said nothing, watching the young man like a hawk. Tell me, Mr. Holworthy, what do you know about a mirror that once hung in the drawing-room? Thomas blinked. A mirror. Tall. Gold frame. Two-way glass. Removed recently. Thomas shook his head slowly. I never noticed it. Holmes gave a slight nod and turned to leave. At the gate, I asked, do you believe him? Holmes didn't answer at first. Then, no. But I believe he believes he's telling the truth. That makes him dangerous, but not in the way Lestrade thinks. And what of Miss Donnell? Holmes's eyes darkened. She's too calm. Her lies are too neat. That's not fear, Watson. That's rehearsal. We returned to the inn in silence. The village around us remained unchanged, quiet lanes, the scent of wet earth, the chirp of birds unaware of human affairs. But I could feel the tension rising, like the tightening of strings before the bow strikes the first note. Holmes remained by the window long after night fell, fingers pressed together. The red herring, he murmured, has done its work. I turned to him. And what is that? To lure the wrong minds in the right direction. And the right minds, further still. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue, a Hidden Inconsistency. It was just past 6 the next morning when I awoke to find Holmes seated at the writing desk in our room, the oil lamp burning low, casting long, flickering shadows across the floorboards. He had not slept. His brow was furrowed, and a single sheet of notepaper rested on the blotter before him, untouched except for a delicate smudge of ash on one corner, evidence of a restless night's reflection. You're early, I remarked, pulling on my dressing gown. Or late, Holmes replied without looking up. Depending on one's perspective. He reached for a small magnifying lens and studied a creased page lying beside his arm. I recognized it as one of the burned fragments from Sir Benedict's recovered will. You've found something, I said, stepping closer. Not something, he murmured, but the absence of something. And that, Watson, is infinitely more interesting. I frowned. Do explain. Holmes turned the fragment toward me and pointed to a section near the bottom. Note the spacing here, where the ink ends abruptly. It's burned, I said. Scorched along the margin. Precisely. Yet observe, there is a ghost of indentation here. He angled the page to the light. See how the paper dips just slightly, as though the next line had been written, but no ink applied. He slid another paper beside it. And here, on this second fragment, ink, faint and incomplete, as if the pen was nearly dry. But the hand matches the first. I looked closer. Indeed, the strokes aligned perfectly with one another, though the sentence on the second page read only, "If the first shall be found unsuitable by reason of." Holmes sat back. He was revising even as he wrote. Drafting by hand, it seems, and then editing on the page. But here's the thing, Watson, this clause, the one concerning Thomas Holworthy, is missing a signature. Not erased. Not burned. Simply absent. You believe it was never signed? Correct. And now consider Miss Donnell's statement. She claimed to have prepared a draft for Sir Benedict to review. Yet this is no draft. This is the document he was writing with his own hand, in private. I blinked. Then she lied. Or omitted. Holmes stood, crossing to the window. The morning mist still clung to the village rooftops like a breath held too long. Holmes stood, crossing to the window. The morning mist still clung to the village rooftops like a breath held too long. There is something not quite right about the timeline, he said. The fire occurred Sunday night. Mrs. Lane was sent away on Friday. That gives us a narrow window, 2 days in which Sir Benedict wrote this note, had it remained intact, and perished. And the gloves. Still the key. If Sir Benedict was preparing to expose something, if the revised will threaten someone's interests, then the gloves may have been his signal. His safeguard. Or perhaps his test. A test. Holmes turned back to me. Imagine you know you are being watched. Spied upon from behind a mirror. You cannot speak freely. You cannot act freely. But you can leave a clue. Something subtle. Something that should not be there. I felt a chill. And if the observer fails to act, then you know who they are. Before I could respond, a knock came at the door. Lestrade entered, breathless and ruddy-cheeked. "We've had a break-in," he announced. Holmes's eyes lit with sudden interest. "Where?" "At the church." "The vicarage?" "No, the church. Someone broke into the crypt. Moved a few stones. Nothing appears stolen, but Penley is in a state." We followed him at once to the village church, a modest grey stone building with ivy crawling up the east wall. Reverend Penley met us at the gates, his silver hair disheveled, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose. "They forced the door after midnight," he explained. "I found it ajar just after morning prayers. Someone entered the crypt, moved the stones above the Holworthy family alcove." Holmes knelt beside the disturbed masonry. "Nothing missing?" "Not that I can tell. Sir Benedict's casket was to be placed here in a week, once the legal proceedings conclude. But as you see, the space is empty." Holmes examined the area carefully, brushing his fingers over the floor. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you recall the gloves?" "Of course." "There was no dirt on them. No soot. No moisture. But look," he pointed to a corner where the stone had shifted, traces of red clay. "The same soil found in Wexmere's gardens, yes, but also here, beneath the crypt." "You think the gloves were here?" "I think someone came here after the fire to retrieve, or to plant, something." Lestrade scratched his head. "But why break into a crypt? There's nothing here." Holmes straightened. "There was something here. Perhaps still is." He turned to Penley. "Who has keys to the crypt?" "Only myself and the groundskeeper, Mr. Elroy. He's trustworthy. Been with us 20 years. Holmes gave a faint smile. Trustworthy men are often used as shields by untrustworthy ones. "Do have the man located, Inspector?" Quietly. Lestrade nodded. We returned to the inn by midday, the air growing colder with each hour. Holmes resumed his station by the fire, now with both glove specimens beside him once again. "Watson," he said after a long silence, "we are looking at this case backward." Backward. We assume the fire was meant to destroy. But what if it was meant to preserve? Or to conceal? I leaned forward. "You mean it was a distraction?" "Exactly. The fire consumed what was needed to build a narrative. Sir Benedict died tragically. The will was lost. The heir restored. But the gloves? They were not meant to be found. Or at least, not yet. He opened his notebook, revealing a simple diagram, a timeline, with names and dotted lines connecting events. This, he said, is the lie. He circled 3 points: gloves recovered, draft of will unsigned, break-in at crypt. One of these does not fit. I peered at the page. The break-in. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. The unsigned will. He stood abruptly. Someone needed it unsigned. But Sir Benedict, I believe, had already signed it. Privately. Which means there must be another copy. One they failed to locate, or one they believed destroyed. And you think it still exists? I think, Holmes said, eyes gleaming, that Sir Benedict was far too clever to place his legacy in the hands of fire alone. Chapter 7. The Crime Grows Stranger. The days following our discovery of the crypt disturbance brought a sequence of unsettling developments, events which, rather than bringing clarity, only deepened the murk of the Holworthy affair. Holmes became increasingly absorbed, retreating into a level of silent intensity one had come to associate only with his most intellectually demanding cases. He spoke little, barely ate, and paced our room at the widow's rest long into the night, his mind evidently working through a tangle of contradictions no one else yet perceived. I feel it, Watson, he muttered one evening, stopping abruptly mid-stride. A pattern, just beneath the surface. It's there, but it refuses to present itself in its full shape. Not yet. What's missing? I asked. Not a what, he said, eyes narrowing. A when. A dislocation in time. This crime is not built on what occurred, but on when it was allowed to occur. The next morning, a telegram arrived from London. Holmes had written discreetly to a contact at the Patent Office 2 days prior, requesting information on unusual material coatings registered within the past 10 years, specifically any designed to resist fire. The reply was brief but impactful. Reg number 4132B, composite silk weave with natural refractory properties. Development origin, Calcutta, 1892. Application filed by M. Donnell, subsidiary of Marrow & Sons. Patent granted 1893. Records Division, Patent Office. I blinked as Holmes handed me the slip. Donnell, I said. Any relation to? Miss Celia Donnell, Holmes confirmed, voice low and measured. Listed in the vicar's records as Sir Benedict's secretary. Daughter of the late Marcus Donnell, chemist, inventor, and textile reformist. A man whose brief partnership with Sir Benedict, years ago, ended without public explanation. I sat back in my chair. You think her presence at Wexmere wasn't coincidence? I think it was the first move. Holmes folded the telegram and pocketed it. We must speak with her again. And this time, we shall not allow rehearsal to substitute for honesty. But before we could depart for her lodgings, Lestrade appeared in the foyer with a grim expression. Holmes, Watson, you'll want to come with me. There's been another incident. The incident had taken place just beyond the village boundary, where the old carriage road curved into a sparse woodland. A farmhand had discovered the body not 2 hours earlier, and Lestrade had sealed the scene quickly. It was the groundskeeper, Mr. Elroy. A quiet man, known to most only as the one who trimmed the hedges and kept the graves tidy. Now he lay crumpled at the base of a tree, his coat torn, his face twisted in an expression of frozen shock. What was the cause? Holmes asked, kneeling beside the body. No sign of violence, Lestrade replied. No wounds, no bruises. Not even frostbite. He's just dead. Like someone snuffed out a candle. Holmes brushed a gloved hand against the soil. Damp. No footprints except the poor man's own. But look, Watson, do you see this? Near the base of the tree was a discolored patch of bark, charred, blackened as though by lightning, yet the sky had been clear all night. And lying not far from the body was a small scrap of fabric, soft, brown, and oddly familiar. We returned to the inn and immediately requested all available documentation regarding Elroy's employment. It revealed little: no family, a sparse employment history, and wages paid directly through the parish. But one detail caught Holmes's attention. "Here," he said, pointing to a column on the payment ledger. "Elroy received a lump sum from Sir Benedict 6 months ago, 3 times his normal wage." "A bonus?" "Or a bribe," Holmes replied. "For silence, perhaps. Or for hiding something." Just then, a constable arrived at our door bearing an envelope. "Delivered to the chapel," he explained. "Left in the donation box." Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a single card with typewritten text. "Some things cannot burn because they are not made of matter. Others survive because they are made of memory. Find the mirror, not the glass, but the one who reflected." Holmes sat down, the card still in hand. "It's a message," I said, "but from whom?" He didn't answer directly. "Watson," he said slowly, "do you recall Sir Benedict's letter, the one discovered amid the ruins?" "Of course. The one that said, 'If even the flame fails, the glove shall remain.'" Holmes nodded. "But what if the glove was never an object? What if it was a person?" I stared at him. "You mean he was naming someone? Someone who survived the fire not by chance, but because they were meant to carry on what he knew?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he stood and retrieved the 2 original gloves from their case, laying them side by side once again. Then, he unwrapped the scrap found by Elroy's body and held it between them. "The weight is different. The fabric thinner. This was never meant to pass as the real thing for long." "What does it mean?" "It means," Holmes said, "that someone has begun replacing evidence. And if that's so, then we are far closer to the truth than our adversary is comfortable with." He folded his hands. "The crime grows stranger, Watson. But so too does its clarity. We must find the mirror, not of glass, but of memory. And I believe I know where to start." Chapter 8: Holmes tests a theory. The fog had lifted somewhat by the time we departed the Widow's Rest that afternoon, but the gloom had not. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet as we wound through Wexmere's crooked lanes, our destination the village library. The establishment was modest, a converted coach-house with high shelves and poor lighting, but Holmes had noted earlier that it shared a curious detail with Wexmere House. Both had once belonged to the Holworthy family. "I wish to examine the local archives," he had said flatly when I inquired about our purpose. "There is something lodged in time, Watson, some detail in the past that refuses to stay buried. We must draw it forth." Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint scent of paper turned brittle with age. The librarian, a prim woman with pince-nez and a whispery voice, guided us toward the parish records, stored in a long drawer labeled Donors, Holdings, Legal Bequests, Wexmere and Surrounds. Holmes plunged into them with unusual vigor. For nearly an hour, he sifted through receipts, letters, and property deeds, pausing only to make faint murmurs or to lift a brow at a document that caught his attention. I remained nearby, flipping through a village ledger that catalogued charitable donations. It was not until I stumbled upon a short entry, dated July of the previous year, that I heard Holmes mutter, "Ah, there you are." We spoke at once. "Sir Benedict donated a private manuscript to the library," I said. "Listed under anonymous memoirs. No author, just initials, M.D. Holmes turned toward me, eyes alight. "Marcus Donnell. I found reference to a joint land purchase between him and Sir Benedict, made in 1893. The same year Donnell patented the fire-resistant silk. But the property was never developed. It lies just behind Wexmere's southern woodline. Unused. Seemingly. But I think our answers lie there. It was never meant to be found, until someone knew to look." Holmes checked his pocket watch. "We must move quickly. By sundown, the trail may be colder than a crypt." The path to the southern woodline was overgrown but passable. Dead leaves crackled beneath our boots, and the skeletal trees swayed gently in the late afternoon breeze. We crossed a shallow stream and emerged into a clearing marked by a dilapidated stone marker, nearly illegible save for the weathered initials, H and D. There, Holmes said, pointing toward a half-buried structure, an old gardener's shed, long collapsed. The roof had given way, and ivy choked the remnants of the doorway. We pried it open. Inside was little more than rotted timber, moldy canvas, and rusted tools, until Holmes knelt and brushed aside a pile of dry leaves. Beneath it lay a trapdoor, reinforced with iron. It was too remote to be casual, he murmured. This was chosen for seclusion. Help me, Watson. We heaved it open, revealing a set of stone steps descending into darkness. Holmes struck a match, then produced a lantern from his satchel and lit it. We descended cautiously. The chamber beneath was small but dry. A table stood at the center, covered in papers, a decayed inkwell, and a sealed tin box. Shelves lined the far wall, filled with jars, samples, and yellowed books. Holmes moved like a man walking through someone else's thoughts. A private laboratory, he said softly. Donnell's sanctuary. Perhaps where the gloves were first conceived. He examined a paper pinned to the wall, cracked with age but still legible. It was a diagram of a human hand, with notes written in a looping script. Reaction stable in 72% of trials. Material resistant to direct flame but destabilizes with oil exposure. Not yet viable for textile application in combat conditions. Military trials, Holmes said. They wanted to create fire-resistant clothing. But it never reached production. Too unstable. He opened the tin box and removed a small bundle of folded cloth. It was a pair of gloves, identical to those recovered from the fire. But these were burned. One was blackened entirely, the other half consumed. An earlier prototype, Holmes murmured. Failed. But they kept it, why? I moved toward the shelves, studying the rows of neatly labeled jars. One read, C. Donnell, Sample 17, Bengal Compound. Celia Donnell was not merely the secretary, I said slowly. She was a chemist. Or at least trained by one. Holmes nodded grimly. And thus, a worthy mirror. Not the object, but the mind. The one who reflected the original creator's intent. He turned to me with a strange calm in his voice. I believe Celia Donnell carried out her father's research here, under Sir Benedict's patronage. When the two men parted ways, she remained. Or returned. And she brought with her not only the knowledge, but the ambition. I frowned. But why the fire? Why the gloves? Why now? Holmes looked at the burned gloves again. Because Sir Benedict was no longer a willing accomplice. He saw what the research had become. He tried to bury it. But she was already 3 steps ahead. Suddenly, Holmes's expression shifted. He turned to the papers again and pulled a crumpled sheet from beneath the tin box. A letter, he said. Watson, listen to this. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The following day broke clear and windless, as though the countryside itself had exhaled after the storm of revelation. A stillness hung over Wexmere, an uneasy calm, the kind that settles not with resolution, but with the knowledge that the first veil has only just been lifted. Celia Donnell had been taken into custody. Lestrade, proud and relieved in equal measure, had already begun drafting his report. The forged glove, the break-in at the crypt, the missing mirror, all pieces now connected by her confession. And yet Holmes remained unsettled. Back at the Widow's Rest, he stood by the window, unmoving, watching the road wind off into the forest beyond. He'd been silent since morning, the only sound in the room the soft creak of the floorboards as I paced. She admitted to it, I said finally. She confessed to setting the fire, attempting to destroy the will, and planting the gloves. What more do you require? Holmes didn't turn. She admitted to acts, he said. Not to motives. I don't follow. Holmes finally turned from the window. Celia Donnell saw herself as her father's successor. The laboratory beneath the woods, the modified glove formula, the preservation of secrecy, it all aligns. But consider this, Watson, she did not kill Sir Benedict directly. She claims he refused to leave the study. That he stayed behind. Yes. And yet, Holmes continued, she never mentioned one critical point, how she knew when to strike. I blinked. You mean, how she timed the fire? Exactly. She could not have simply assumed the house would be empty of servants and vulnerable to blaze at the perfect moment. No. Someone provided her that window. And I believe that someone was already inside the house. You think she had an accomplice? Holmes shook his head. No. I think someone else had their own reason for wanting Sir Benedict gone. And Miss Donnell's desperation merely gave them the means. By noon, we were once more walking the lanes of Wexmere, this time toward the village solicitor's office. Julian March had been notably absent from the prior day's events. A man of legal mind, yes, but Holmes suspected his interests in the estate had extended beyond parchment. Do not mistake absence for innocence, Holmes said. It is often the most measured of men who act most decisively when their share is threatened. March greeted us with a mix of civility and apprehension. I heard the news, he said, gesturing toward the fireplace. Miss Donnell. I can't say I'm surprised. There was always something cold in her eyes. You knew her father, Holmes said. March hesitated. Only through Sir Benedict. They were collaborators for a time. But that was long ago. You managed the estate's holdings. I still do. Holmes took a seat. Then you know the will found beneath the folly is both signed and dated. Legally binding. It names not only Thomas Holworthy as beneficiary, but also a charitable trust for Donnell's research, overseen by an external counsel. March stiffened. That complicates things. Indeed it does. For it suggests Sir Benedict was not attempting to erase her father's name, but to protect it. March folded his hands. Then why conceal it? Holmes's voice was calm. Perhaps because he feared someone would misuse it. He leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Mr. March, were you aware of the revised will before Sir Benedict's death? March didn't answer at once. Then, only in part. He had asked me to review early language. There was no mention of a trust at the time. And when did that change? Shortly before the fire. But he never consulted me again. He said he was handling it privately. Holmes nodded slowly. And you did not question this? I did, March admitted. But I also know how stubborn he could be. I assumed he was revising it alone, perhaps with Miss Donnell's help. Holmes was quiet a moment longer. Then, what would have happened, Mr. March, had the original will remained the only valid version? March blinked. Thomas would have inherited everything. I would have continued as legal executor. And what of the research documents? They would have been archived, or destroyed, depending on Thomas's wishes. Convenient, Holmes said. Tell me, did you meet with Thomas Holworthy the week before the fire? March looked up sharply. No. Holmes nodded as if confirming something already suspected. Then he lied. Outside, Holmes's face was unreadable. We walked in silence toward the village square, the bell in the distant church tower marking the 3rd hour of the afternoon. Finally, I asked, what do you make of it? He claims no involvement, Holmes said. But March knew more than he admitted. And yet, he did not act. He feared exposure, not prosecution. And Thomas? We must speak with him again. We found Holworthy on the edge of the village green, seated beneath an elm with a journal open in his lap. He closed it as we approached. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The church hall slowly emptied as the candlelight faded, casting long, swaying shadows along the ancient stone floor. Outside, the air was crisp, still holding the faint scent of smoke and autumn leaves. Lestrade and his men had taken Daniel March into custody, with Holmes providing a succinct summary of his involvement, supported by enough circumstantial and physical evidence to demand further interrogation. And yet, even with the web of complicity now exposed, the fire, the forged evidence, the interference with the will. Holmes seemed curiously restless, as though some delicate balance within the case had shifted out of reach. Back at the widow's rest, he paced in short lines across our modest room, pipe clenched between his teeth, though unlit. "There is something wrong, Watson," he muttered. "Something unsaid. Something hiding in plain view." I watched him in silence for a moment. "You mean Daniel March?" "No. His role is complete. Greed. Concealment. A petty mind with dangerous access. But the deeper architecture, who laid the foundation for the deception, that root still evades us." He stopped pacing and pulled the chair opposite mine. "Watson, do you recall Sir Benedict's letter, the one retrieved from the box beneath the folly?" "Clearly. He wrote of fire, of survival, of gloves that should not burn." Holmes nodded. "And in that letter, he said, if even the flame fails, the glove shall remain." Everyone interpreted that literally. But what if it was figurative? I frowned. "A symbol?" "Yes. A person." He leaned forward. Sir Benedict's final warning was not about fireproof materials. It was about someone who had resisted corruption. Someone who remained untouched, not by flames, but by influence. "Penley," I suggested. "He helped hide the will." Holmes shook his head. "Penley is a man of conscience. But he was a messenger. The glove was someone else." He stood suddenly and opened the valise on the side table. From within, he drew out the original pair of gloves, the ones that had sparked this entire affair. One left. One right. Still intact. "They were recovered separately," he said. "One in the drawing room. One in the east wing. But ask yourself, Watson, why would Sir Benedict divide them? To make them harder to destroy? Or to point toward two different people?" He crossed to the desk, retrieved a pencil, and sketched a rough diagram on the back of an envelope. Left glove. Right glove. Two halves of the same protection. Celia Donnell was one. She had knowledge, ambition, and danger. But who was the other? Who bore the opposite half? He tapped the envelope once. Someone Sir Benedict trusted more than anyone. A silence settled between us. Then it came to me. "The housekeeper," I said slowly. Holmes looked up. "Gertrude Lane." "She was absent the night of the fire," I continued. "Sent away, deliberately, by Sir Benedict. He ensured her safety. But why?" Holmes's voice dropped. "Because she knew everything." Within the hour, we were on our way to Miss Lane's modest cottage, lanterns casting gold across the hedgerows. She welcomed us at the door without protest, as though expecting our return. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. "Miss Lane," Holmes began gently, "I must ask you to set aside your loyalty and speak plainly. We have uncovered much, but there remains one part of this tale known only to you." She stared into her cup. "You've found the will." "We have. And the laboratory. And the men who tried to silence them both. But what we haven't found is why Sir Benedict acted so late. Why he delayed finalizing his changes. Unless—" She looked up. "He already had," Holmes finished. Her eyes glistened. "He signed the will 3 months before the fire." Holmes nodded. "But he left it unsigned in the solicitor's copies. Because he suspected someone inside the legal process would try to destroy it. So he asked you to keep the original." She reached beneath her chair and withdrew a small tin case, worn, plain, and unmistakably identical to the one found beneath the folly. She handed it to Holmes without a word. Inside was the second original. Same language. Same date. Same signature. "It was a test," she said. "He told me that if the house ever burned, and the gloves survived, I should come forward only when someone proved they had found the other." Holmes's face was solemn. "You were the second glove," he said. She nodded. "He called me his protection from within." "Why didn't you reveal it sooner?" I asked. "Because I wasn't sure who I could trust. Until I heard what you did in the hall tonight." Holmes closed the tin gently. "You were the mirror, Miss Lane. Not the mirror on the wall, but the one he relied on to reflect what was true. Her voice quivered. He was a difficult man, but he tried to correct what he had allowed. I only did my part. Holmes stood. And you did it well. As we stepped outside into the night, Holmes paused beneath the stars and looked back toward the glowing cottage window. 2 gloves, Watson, he said. One born of ambition, the other of conscience. And between them, a man who finally understood that what survives the flame is not what resists fire, but what deserves to endure. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The revelation of Miss Lane's guardianship over the second original will was like the tightening of a final knot in Holmes's web. The conspiracy had been vast in its silence but ultimately flawed in its execution. Sir Benedict, for all his secrecy, had outplayed his enemies with the quiet loyalty of a housekeeper, a scrap of linen, and the indelible stroke of a pen. And yet, as we returned to the widow's rest that night, Holmes remained unusually tense, his eyes darting between shadows, his steps quickened. He spoke little, until we reached our room and closed the door. "He will try again," Holmes said suddenly. "Daniel March?" I asked. "His in custody." Holmes shook his head. "Not Daniel. He was a tool, a blade wielded by another hand. The true mind behind this has not yet shown themselves." I frowned. "You suspect another player?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Think, Watson. Celia Donnell had motive and knowledge. Daniel March had access and ambition. But neither had the power to suppress the truth once the will resurfaced. Neither had the legal expertise, nor the reach to plant inconsistencies in the estate's archives, or to manipulate the solicitor's trust." "You're implying—" "I'm stating," Holmes interrupted, "that Julian March has not been exonerated by his brother's arrest. On the contrary, I believe Daniel acted at his bidding, willingly or not." "But wouldn't Julian run now?" Holmes smiled grimly. "No. He'll do what cornered men always do, try to reclaim control." A knock at the door interrupted us. It was Lestrade, his coat damp from the mist, his expression alert. "You'd best come," he said. "Thomas Holworthy's gone. Vanished from his room at the inn not 30 minutes ago. And the March office was found ransacked." Holmes sprang into action. "His tying off loose ends," he said. "Destroying what he can. If he has the real materials, Sir Benedict's research, his notes, he will flee. Tonight." "Flee to where?" I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Somewhere that offers protection. Or—" He paused. "A port." By midnight, we were on the road to Portsmouth, accompanied by Lestrade and 2 constables. The carriage wheels rumbled over the rough earth, the moonlight dancing through the trees. "Holworthy hasn't the cunning to organize this," Lestrade muttered. "He's just a sulking heir." "He was the beneficiary of everything," Holmes said. "And the perfect distraction. While we watched him, March operated in silence. And now that the will has surfaced, the balance shifts. I believe Julian March is planning to leave England entirely, and take with him the only remaining copies of Donnell's full research. Not to preserve it, but to sell it." I leaned forward. "But to whom?" Holmes didn't answer, but his expression turned cold. Portsmouth Harbor was cloaked in darkness, the fog rolling thick across the piers. Dock workers moved like ghosts through the mist, lanterns bobbing with the rhythm of the sea. Holmes led the way, his eyes scanning the names on the shipping ledger posted near the main quay. "There," he said, pointing. "The Westmark. Bound for Amsterdam. Cargo vessel. Leaves within the hour." We hurried toward the far pier, and as we turned the corner of a warehouse, we spotted 2 figures ascending the gangplank, one of them tall, composed, a leather satchel in hand. Julian March. Holmes didn't wait. "Stop that man," he called, breaking into a run. March turned at the sound, then bolted down the gangplank. He made it 2 strides before Lestrade tackled him onto the pier, the satchel skidding across the planks. A sharp crack echoed through the night. A pistol fired. We dropped to cover. One of the constables returned fire. The second man, Thomas Holworthy, staggered, clutching his shoulder. He fell hard beside a stack of crates, the gun tumbling from his hand. Holmes was there in a breath, kicking the weapon away and pulling Thomas upright. "You're no killer, Mr. Holworthy," he said, coldly. "But you were willing to become one to preserve the illusion." Julian March was pulled to his feet by Lestrade, his glasses shattered, his lip bleeding. He said nothing. Holmes retrieved the satchel and opened it. Inside, tightly packed, were dozens of documents, Sir Benedict's annotated journals, copies of chemical schematics, letters addressed to military officials abroad, everything needed to market the Fireproof formula as private intellectual property. Holmes exhaled. "You were going to sell it." March replied, "I was going to save it from dust. From decay. From lawyers and trustees and small minds." "You were going to profit," Holmes corrected. "From the work of the man you helped destroy." Holworthy groaned from where he sat slumped against the crate. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." Holmes turned to him. "That's what they always say. But it never begins this far. It always begins with silence." We returned to Wexmere with both men in custody. The fog lifted with the first rays of dawn. The documents were placed into secure storage. The trust, per Sir Benedict's wishes, was formally established under Reverend Penleig's supervision. Holmes and I stood once more before the ruins of Wexmere House. "Remarkable," I said quietly. "How much one man tried to conceal, and how much more he tried to protect." Holmes nodded. "In the end, it was not the fire that failed, Watson. It was the people who believed it could erase consequence." He turned from the ashes and began to walk. But it could not erase the truth. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in, the final clue revealed. The morning after the arrest of Julian March and Thomas Holworthy brought with it a sense of finality, but not peace. The village of Wexmere stirred cautiously, its people whispering beneath drawn curtains, while the smoke-tinged ruins of Wexmere House remained a silent sentinel of all that had passed. For most, the mystery had ended. The culprits were in custody, the stolen research recovered, and Sir Benedict's last will safeguarded. But for Holmes, something vital remained unfinished. The events, he said as we walked the church path in the chill of late morning, fit too neatly, as though tied off with a ribbon. And yet the knot, Watson, is not the kind I trust. I gave him a puzzled look. "What are you implying?" He stopped beside the old cemetery wall, his eyes narrowing against the sun's pale gleam. "I'm implying that we still lack the final why. The actions of March and Holworthy are evident. But motive, the true spark, remains unspoken. I intend to light it." We continued on toward the vicarage. Reverend Penleigh had invited us for tea to discuss the formal transfer of Sir Benedict's research trust. It was, Holmes insisted, also the perfect setting for one final test. The vicarage was a quiet, warm place, filled with the scent of dried lavender and old parchment. Penleigh greeted us in his study, the same space where we'd first glimpsed his knowledge of the hidden will. Now he stood over a small table stacked with folders, ledgers, and a wax-sealed envelope bearing the Holworthy crest. "I've prepared the documents," he said. "With Miss Lane's assistance, the trust should be operational within a fortnight." Holmes nodded approvingly. "An act most befitting of your stewardship, Reverend." Penleigh inclined his head. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a small folded note, the final page recovered from March's satchel, which he had not yet disclosed publicly. He passed it silently to Penleigh. The Reverend read it, then looked up. "You think this changes things?" "I think it explains them," Holmes said. I leaned over Penleigh's shoulder and read. "Our agreement stands. Once the will is destroyed, no further contact. You will receive your share once the materials are sold abroad. Your silence, as ever, is your value." The letter was unsigned, but Holmes had already noted the watermark, Wexmere Parish Stationery. Penleigh was pale. He began, but Holmes held up a hand. "Please. Allow me." He turned to face both of us, his voice calm. "The final clue, Watson, was not found in the documents or the ruins. It was found in the sequence of behavior. Consider, Penleigh knew about the gloves. He guided us to the will's hiding place. He presented himself as the moral anchor of the case. But that letter reveals a private transaction, one not accounted for in his narrative. Penley shook his head. That's not what it seems. Holmes pressed on. You were approached by Julian March months ago. He knew you were Sir Benedict's confidant. He offered you a portion of the proceeds from the patent sale if you remained silent about the revised will. You agreed. But when Sir Benedict changed course, hiding the true will under the folly and instructing Miss Lane to guard it, your alliance shifted. Penley's voice was faint. I didn't know what he would do. You suspected. And you said nothing. Holmes stepped closer. You saw a storm building, and you chose to watch rather than warn. Your silence made the crime possible. And when guilt crept in, you attempted to redeem yourself by aiding us, selectively. I felt a strange sadness watching Penley lower his gaze. I feared exposure would destroy the trust, he whispered. The village. The reputation of a good man. Sir Benedict? Holmes asked. Penley hesitated. Myself. Holmes gave a small nod. You were not the architect, Reverend. But you were the locked door through which the architect passed unseen. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Holmes placed a hand on the Reverend's shoulder, not accusing, not condemning, but firm. Justice, Reverend, is not purity. It is balance. And balance has now been restored. That afternoon, Lestrade returned from Portsmouth bearing confirmation. Julian March had confessed under pressure. The scheme had begun more than a year prior, an effort to commercialize Donnell's fire-resistant formula, using Sir Benedict's failing health as a cover to rewrite his legacy. When Benedict resisted, they planned to erase him, both legally and physically. Celia Donnell, manipulated by her devotion to her father's work, became the perfect scapegoat. What of Holworthy? I asked. He'll likely be charged with obstruction and conspiracy, Lestrade said. But it's March who'll face the noose. And Penley? I said carefully. Holmes only replied, he'll answer for his own silence. That evening, we stood once more before the ruins of Wexmere House. The sun dipped low, casting long fingers of gold across the blackened stone. Holmes knelt and placed the two gloves, cleaned and preserved, at the edge of the scorched foundation. Symbols, he said. One of betrayal. One of protection. I stood beside him, silent. Then Holmes spoke again, softer now. But in the end, Watson, it was the third glove, conscience, that held the weight of this case. Not worn, not seen, but felt. We turned from the ruins, the wind rising behind us, carrying with it the final ashes of the fire that could not silence the truth. ChatGPT said, Chapter 15, The Final Gathering. 2 days had passed since the failed escape at Portsmouth, and already Wexmere seemed to be shedding the weight of its ordeal. A cool autumn breeze swept down from the downs, stirring the leaves in the churchyard and whistling through the blackened shell of Wexmere House, which now stood cordoned off by order of the magistrate. The once grand estate had become a symbol of justice earned and secrets unearthed. But for Holmes, the work was not yet done. He stood that morning at the edge of the graveyard, coat buttoned high, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on nothing I could see. Though the investigation had reached its conclusion in every official sense, March and Holworthy under guard, Celia Donnell's confession secured, Holmes had requested one last gathering. Not a trial, nor a hearing. A reckoning, of sorts. And so, under a grey and whispering sky, we convened at the village hall. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the brass wall clock and the occasional shuffle of a chair leg. Present were all who had survived the fire's design. Miss Lane, seated stiffly with gloved hands folded on her lap, Reverend Penley, pale but composed, Thomas Holworthy, recently released into temporary house arrest pending trial, and Julian March, drawn and cuffed, flanked by 2 constables. Even Celia Donnell had been permitted attendance under strict supervision, her presence ghostlike, the weight of her actions visible in every motion. Holmes stood at the center of it all, calm and erect. No more surprises, he began, his voice even and precise. This, I believe, is the last light we need to cast over a case that began with a glove and ends, as many truths do, with a choice of silence or admission. He paused, letting his gaze fall upon each person in turn. Sir Benedict Holworthy's death was not the result of a simple act of arson, he continued. It was a carefully orchestrated event, designed not to kill, but to cleanse, to burn away legacy, oversight, and dissent. His decision to revise his will, to endow a trust that safeguarded dangerous knowledge from greedy hands, set this entire tragedy into motion. He turned slightly. Celia Donnell was the first spark. In her father's memory, she sought to protect his work. But fear, of erasure, of obscurity, drove her into the service of those who saw opportunity rather than principle. Celia did not flinch. Her eyes were distant. Daniel March, Holmes continued, became the enabler. He manipulated letters, planted evidence, and moved in the shadows. But he did not act alone. His brother, Julian March, sought not justice, not science, but control of knowledge, and the power to profit from it. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again, the fight seemingly gone from him. Holmes turned to Thomas Holworthy. And you, Mr. Holworthy, were the inheritor not only of an estate but of its decay. You stood at a crossroads, and you stepped aside, hoping the fire would do your choosing for you. Thomas looked down, his voice barely audible. I didn't think it would come to this. No, Holmes said. But you hoped it might. He turned last to Miss Lane and Reverend Penley. And you both, through silence, allowed the kindling to gather. One out of loyalty, the other out of shame. Reverend Penley inclined his head. And yet it is your voice that has named it all, Mr. Holmes. Holmes looked at him steadily. My voice does nothing without the facts. And facts are indifferent to those who speak them. He stepped back. The truth of this case is not in the fire, nor the gloves, nor the documents. It is in the quiet moments, the folded letter no one read, the glove no one expected to survive, the voice that did not shout but whispered from beneath floorboards. These are the clues that matter. And they led us here. Lestrade stood now and gestured for the constables to escort Julian March and Celia Donnell from the hall. Thomas followed without protest, his shoulders slumped. Miss Lane remained, eyes glassy, as if unmoved. Penley sat still, his hands folded tightly over a prayer book. As the room emptied, Holmes turned to me. It's finished, I said. Holmes nodded. In a legal sense, yes. But we must remember, Watson, that mysteries do not end where justice begins. They end where understanding settles, and that often takes longer. Outside, the wind picked up again, lifting the edge of Holmes's coat. He paused on the church steps, watching as the last of the carriage wheels vanished into the mist. He took from his coat the two gloves, the original pair, and held them briefly before slipping them into a small wooden box. Will you keep them? I asked. No, he said quietly. They belong to Miss Lane. To Wexmere. To what remains of it. We walked in silence as the village came back into view. Children were playing in the lane. A postman whistled a tune. A woman swept her stoop, pausing only to nod politely as we passed. Normalcy, after everything. And Holmes, as ever, kept moving forward. Chapter 16, Holmes' Final Reflection. The train ride back to London was quiet. The sun was setting beyond the fields, casting long orange shadows across the hills, as if the land itself were drawing a curtain on Wexmere's long-held secrets. I sat opposite Holmes in the compartment, notebook tucked away, coat folded on the bench beside me, content at last to say nothing. Holmes, however, was not resting. Though still in body, I could see the calculations flickering behind his eyes, memories of evidence, confession, concealment, and truth. Eventually, he spoke. It is always the simple clue that resolves the most intricate deception, Watson. The glove, I said, nodding. He gave a faint smile. Yes, and no. The glove was a signal. But the true clue, the one that revealed everything, was timing. Not what happened, but when and how long it was allowed to happen. He pulled from his coat pocket the small folded diagram he had drawn earlier in the case. The two gloves marked left and right, lines connecting suspects, actions, consequences. He stared at it for a moment, then tucked it back into his notebook. March was precise, he continued. Celia was passionate. Thomas was passive. And Penley, he was caught between faith and fear. Each of them played a part, but none believed the truth would endure past the flames. I nodded. And yet, it did. Holmes looked toward the window. It always does, if you listen hard enough. The whistle of the train pierced the quiet as we passed a farmhouse, its windows glowing warmly in the dusk. Holmes tapped the glass absently, as though keeping time with a thought that had not yet fully formed. "I've been thinking," I said, breaking the silence, "about Sir Benedict's legacy. In the end, he gave his estate, his fortune, even his reputation, to ensure his conscience outlived his mistakes. An uncommon act," Holmes said, "especially for a man who lived so long in comfort. Most try to preserve the illusion of righteousness. He chose to confront it. And the others?" Holmes tilted his head slightly. "March will face trial. Holworthy, too. Celia Donnell may never leave the asylum, but perhaps that is just. Her ambition was not evil, only untethered. The fire that could not burn her gloves could not temper her heart." He turned to me with something rare in his expression, regret. "There was a moment, Watson, in the drawing-room at Wexmere, before the ashes cooled, when I wondered if I had come too late. If the truth had already been erased. And I realized then how fragile it is. Not just facts, but memory, justice, legacy, all of it built on silence, and the hope that someone will one day listen." I watched him for a moment before speaking. "You listened, Holmes. And you saw." His gaze softened. "As did you." The train began to slow as we neared London. The lights of the city shimmered in the distance, a mosaic of windows and fog and coal smoke. Holmes stood, brushing his coat sleeve free of dust. "One final thought, Watson," he said as he retrieved his walking stick. "When the glove was found, everyone assumed it was a relic of tragedy. But it wasn't. It was a message." He looked at me squarely. "And messages, once decoded, are no longer mysteries. They are truths." We disembarked at Victoria Station, stepping into the familiar rhythm of city life. Carriages clattered, porters shouted, and the scent of London, coal, damp, and steel, wrapped around us like an old coat. As we hailed a hansom, I couldn't help but ask, "And the gloves? What will you do with them?" Holmes hesitated, then replied, "They are no longer mine to keep. They belong to the story. Miss Lane will decide whether they are buried, framed, or forgotten. As all legacies must be." I nodded. The cab pulled away, and Holmes turned once more to the street, his gaze distant yet oddly content. There was no grand statement, no flourish of intellect, no applause. Only silence. And in that silence, the fire that had consumed a house, a family, and nearly the truth itself, at last, went out.